Hello, I'm Dale Yurton, and welcome to a brand new study on the book of Esther. I'm going to be doing 5 lessons from the life of this remarkable young lady. I'm calling it Wake Up Esther, Wake Up Esther, and you'll see why as we go through why I've chosen this particular theme. This lesson number 1, I'm going to entitle The Vigilant Church. The Vigilant Church. And we're going to apply the life of Esther to you and I today as Christian believers, as a part of the church. I will use for my text Esther, the 4th chapter, beginning with verse 13. Mordecai, this is the cousin that had adopted Esther as his own daughter. Mordecai told them to answer Esther, "Do not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the Jews. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. Yet, who knows whether you have come into the kingdom for such a time as this." Well, those are beautiful words and probably the most famous words from the book of Esther, as Mordecai is challenging her to rise to her destiny. Now, to give you a little bit of background about this story, Esther was an orphaned Jewish girl in slavery in what we would say modern day Iran. The Bible calls the country of Persia. 58 years earlier, God had opened a door for the Jews to return to Jerusalem. And you can read that whole history in the book of Ezra and the book of Nehemiah. So God's opened this door of opportunity for them to return back to Jerusalem. But many of them did not go. Why? Because Babylon had become home. And then later in this story, Persia is the modern capital city, and this was home to them. That's all Esther had ever known. She had never seen Jerusalem before. And so because of this, most of the Jews weren't alert to the opportunity, and they missed it. And this is the story of the Jews who didn't return. That's what the book of Esther is all about. So we're going to examine it, and I'm going to use 4 major points here to talk about what happened to these Jews that remained behind in Persia. The first thing I want to discuss with you is the providence of God. Providence. Now, that's a theological term that preachers throw around it, but a lot of people do not understand. The word providence comes from 2 words, pro and video. And so it's quite obvious. This means to be able to see things beforehand. That's the way God looks at history, the way he looks at time. He's able to look into the future and see exactly what's going to happen. And so in the providence of God, God makes all events fulfill the original design for which he created them. Now, of course, for you and I, sometimes we miss the will of God. And that's what had happened for these Jews that had remained behind in Shushan, the palace in the capital city of Persia. But God was still at work in their lives. Now, something very significant in the book of Esther, and it's even caused some Bible teachers and preachers to question whether the book of Esther should have been included in the canon of Holy Scripture. In the book of Esther, God's name is not mentioned one time, not once. In the book of Esther, do you find God referred to? No, rather, it's a story of a pagan king. The story is set in the palace of this pagan king, and it revolves around three major feasts that this king has. Now, that doesn't sound much like a religious story. It doesn't sound like some biblical truth. Where is God in all of this? It just goes to show that those times when we ignore God, when we fail to follow God, oh yes, God is still there, but he's behind the curtain. He's behind the open scenes, and you don't see him. He's still working. We simply do not see him. And so we do not see God's name mentioned one time in the book of Esther. Now, I'd like to ask you a question that is something every one of us can relate to. What do we do when we have missed God's will? And all of us have. What do we do? See, there are some things that are actually beyond our control. And a lot of this is true for Esther. The Jews that had failed to return to Jerusalem now found their lives in great danger. They were in danger of all being killed, genocide, destroying a whole people group. That's what they're facing right now because they failed to follow the will of God, the opportunity that God had given to them. But what about people like Esther? She was born in Persia. It's all that she ever knew. It wasn't her fault that she was born there. It's not her fault that her parents were slaves in Persia. What do we do when life isn't fair? And in many times, it's not, my friend. There are so many situations and circumstances over which we have no control whatsoever. We don't know, according to the Bible, there is nothing given about the story of Esther's parents. It's not even mentioned in the story. We don't know why they were there in Shushan. We don't know why they were in Persia. Possibly they had grown up as slaves there themselves. But they've married, they have this baby girl, and then suddenly they're out of the story. We never hear of them again. It was then that her cousin, Mordecai, comes into the picture. Now, it's not Esther's fault that she was an orphaned Hebrew girl in Persia. That's not her fault at all. That's something that happened to her. What do you do when life is not fair? Oh, here's another question. I've got several questions here in this opening. What do we do when we've married someone angry? Now, I'm asking that question because it relates perfectly to this story. There's a story that is told about the king of the book of Esther, and this king had a farmer that had brought him a gift that he loved very much. And because of that, he rewarded him with great favor. Because he had the favor of the king, the farmer and his wife are getting up in years. And so he went to the king when the king is getting ready to lead his soldiers into battle. And this history records this about this particular king in the book of Esther. And he begged of him, please, just I've got several sons and they're going to war to fight for you, but Your Honor, my wife and I are getting advanced in years and we cannot care for ourselves. Could my eldest son just stay home and take care of Mama and myself? And the king was so angry, he called for the boy to be brought before him. And there before the shocked gaze of this farmer, he has the boy marched out to a road, cut his body in half, in two pieces, and laid the pieces on each side of the road, and then commanded his soldiers to march between the two parts of the boy's dead body. That's the king Esther has married. What do you do when the man you thought was Prince Charming suddenly turns into an angry monster. That's what's happening in Esther's life. In fact, it's one of the reasons why she becomes the queen, is because the king had become so angry that he divorced his previous wife and looks for a new queen, and Esther becomes that queen. What do we do when that happens to us? We have to learn to seek the face of God. And God, in his providence, because he's able to see into the future, helps us make wise decisions that will change our situation in life. Now, here's the second thing I want to talk to you about. The plan of God. The plan of God. There's a good statement. The door of history swings on small hinges. Boy, that is the truth. Little things that we tend to overlook and don't realize God is working in our life even when we can't see him, when we don't know that he is there. It's well said, disappointments are not a sign of God's disapproval. Just because things did not turn out the way you wanted them to, or the way that you thought they were going to turn out, doesn't mean that God is angry with you. Not at all. It's just a disappointment in life. However, God can take the smallest things in our lives and turn our lives around. He can completely change the story. Just little things that we do. And so the truth is, God, behind the scenes, was at work in Esther's life even when she couldn't see it. He was still there. He's still on the throne. And the same is true for you and I. That even though we may not see God actively at work, I assure you, he is. He is at work in our life, and he can take little decisions that we make and turn our story around. For instance, in this case, God had brought Esther into the palace through a beauty contest. Who would have ever dreamed that this is the way the new queen is going to be chosen? And Esther, the Jewish slave? But see, nobody knew that she was Jewish. Nobody knew that she was a slave girl. In fact, Mordecai changed her name from a Hebrew name to a Persian name, and he calls her Esther. That little decision, that small decision, was a hinge that turned the doors of history. And the orphan Jewish girl wins the beauty contest and becomes the next queen. My, it's almost like reading a fairy tale, but it's not a fairy tale, and neither is your life a fairy tale. Your life is not an accident looking for a place to happen. Not at all. God is involved in the details of your life. And if you will seek him, you will find him and know what he wants you to do. The truth is, God had hidden Esther in the palace for this very moment. God knew what was going to take place. He knew this time of genocide for the Jews was getting ready to take place, and he's already got his agent in place. Mordecai understood it. He looked at this and he said, that's what God is doing. Mordecai understood Esther had come into royalty for such a time as this. He said, it's not an accident you've become the queen of Persia. God put you there to redeem his people. And I would challenge you in the same way, that even though you cannot see him working, he's still working. Even though you can't see his name, he's still there doing his work in our lives. There was a new prime minister that had come into power. His name was Haman. Haman hated the Jews, and he was already making his plans how he could destroy them. But Haman does not know God is at work in Persia. God is at work in Esther's world, just like he's at work in our world. And Esther has become God's secret agent. Haman would have never guessed. He never had any idea the identity, who this young woman really is. That she is a Jewish slave girl on the throne. If he had, I'm sure he would have made some other moves. He would have been much more careful about his attempt to kill all the Jews. But Haman doesn't know any more than the devil knows everything happening in your life. The devil doesn't know, but God knows, and he's got a plan for you and I. Let me talk about the third thing. The third thing I want to discuss is the presence of God. Now, I've already mentioned to you that God's name is not mentioned once in the book of Esther. However, the acrostics for God's name is hidden 5 times in the book of Esther. Let me show you what I'm talking about. If you look in Esther, the first chapter in verse 20, there's a statement, all the wives shall give. Now, this is spoken by the king, the Persian king's advisors, his political advisors. They're giving him advice, what he's to do. And if you look at the original manuscripts, the documents that are the oldest that we have of these scriptures, there are acrostics. The first words in that statement, all the wives shall give, are highlighted in bold text. It's HVHY. It's a hidden name for Jehovah. Jehovah. Again, in Esther, the 5th chapter, in verse 4, there's a statement, let the king and Haman come. Let the king and Haman come. Again, here's the acrostics. The first words of these words, the first letters of these words are in bold print. It's YHVH. It's Esther that's talking here. She's a Jew. She has revelation that God is at work, even when he's behind the scenes. Now, something you notice is when it is a Jew that is speaking, it's in its proper context, YHVH. When it is a Persian that is speaking, one that did not have a covenant with God, one that did not personally know God, it's reversed. It's HVHY. Another one of the 5 times that we find God's name hidden in acrostics is in Esther, the 5th chapter, and verse 13. The statement, this avails me nothing. Now, that's Haman talking now, a Persian. And again, they reversed the order of God's sacred name. The closest we would know to pronounce it is Yahweh. And it's HVHY. Haman is speaking there. And again, one thing I need to point out concerning it's Haman talking. He's the one that's trying to destroy the Jews. But Psalm 76 and verse 10 gives us a wonderful promise. For the wrath of man shall praise you. He's saying God's even able to take what the devil does and turn it around for God's glory. Turn it around for the good of God's people. And that's what happens in this story. One other case where we find YHVH, Yahweh, hidden in acrostics is Esther 7 and 7, where it says, there was evil determined against him. Now that's the author of the book of Esther, the Hebrew author, that is speaking, a Jewish believer. Now, one other time, the 5th time, it's a unique word. It's the word that's translated, I am that I am. And we find this in Esther, the 7th chapter and verse 5, where the king says, who is he and where is he? he's looking for the one that's wanting to destroy the Jews, and he discovers it's Haman. It's the king that is speaking, but it's I am that I am. The same Hebrew words that's used at the burning bush, where God appeared to Moses and said, I am that I am. Now, it's Esther's responsibility to expose the deception of Haman. He had deceived the king, but he had not deceived Esther. He had not deceived Mordecai. They knew exactly what was going on. Now, the fourth thing that I want to share with you from this amazing story is the purpose of God. The purpose of God. In this story, God's plan of salvation is revealed. It includes us as recipients and parcipients. In other words, we're not just receiving salvation, we are included in God's plan of salvation. That is so true for us today, that God not only is working in our lives, God is also working through our lives to bring his redemption to others. Now, in this story, we find that Mordecai, a very spiritual man, a godly man, he's the one that recognized his little cousin that was left as an orphan girl in a strange land, and he said, I will adopt her. And Mordecai obviously is a very thoughtful man, a man of prayer, a man that sought after God and God's will in his life. I would encourage you, follow his example. Do the same thing that Mordecai is doing. He's praying. And not only is he praying, but he's trying to get everybody else that he possibly can to pray with him, to agree with him. Because Mordecai knows that without God's deliverance, they are going to be destroyed. They're going to die in Shushan, the palace of the king. He understands that, so he's praying. What is he praying? What is he praying about? Mordecai is requesting more than God's deliverance for the Jews. Now let me slow down here because I want you to think this thing through. I think there's too many times that as Christians, as believers, that we spend most of our time praying about ourselves, about what's going to happen to us, so what's going to take place in my life, and we're trying, to maximize our potential, be everything we were created to be. Mordecai is praying bigger than that. He's not just praying for God's deliverance of the Jews. No, Mordecai is asking God to awaken Esther to her God-given destiny and opportunity. Wow, what a statement. I would encourage every one of you, if you're a spiritual leader, that's what you need to be praying, for God to wake up the church. Just like Mordecai is praying and asking God to awaken Esther. Wake up, Esther. She is asleep in the palace. Asleep in the palace. What a tragedy. And yet, I see the same thing is what we are facing with the church today. Oh, may God help us. But there are so many churches that spiritually, they are asleep. In fact, I think sometimes by attending some of their worship services that physically they are asleep. They're not paying attention. They don't know what's going on. They don't hear the cry of a dying world. They don't accept the responsibility of the Great Commission. That's my responsibility. That's your responsibility. It's time for us to awaken out of our slumber, to get up and do what we're supposed to do. Who knows but whether you have come into royalty for such a time as this. See, the truth of it was, this was to become Esther's finest hour. Mordecai recognized that. Mordecai recognized that Esther has been brought into the palace. God brought her there as his secret agent to redeem us, to save us from this terrible genocide. The devil wants to destroy us. He's out to kill us. And that's exactly his plan for us. Jesus said, referring to the devil, the thief comes but to kill, steal, and destroy. And that's exactly the devil's plan for you and your family. Don't allow it to happen. Do what Esther did. She got up from her bed. She got up. She awakened out of her sleep, and she says, if I perish, I perish. But I will go and make intercession with the king. God bless Esther. God bless Mordecai because of their diligence, because they worked in harmony together. God was able to use them to save the Jewish people. It was because of Esther's vigilance, because she awakened, that she was able to save her people. Now I challenge you, my friend, please, don't sleep your life away. Don't waste your opportunities. Don't look for, well, if I was just somewhere else, if I wasn't in such a terrible situation. And don't think that way. He that is in you is greater than he that is in the world. It's time to awaken to our destiny and realize God has given us this opportunity. We're not going to waste it. We're going to arise. We're going to fulfill the plan of God, the purpose of God in our lives, just like Esther did. And so I challenge you, just like Mordecai challenged Esther, who knows but whether you have come into royalty for such a time as this.